State. She criticised them over some factors, which maybe she could have been lying, right? Everybody lies as soon as you escape the last slither of Islamic Caliphate. You say, yeah, my husband was the bike mechanic, you know, he had nothing to do with anything, he was killed in an airstrike, he wasn't guilty.
Did you ask her specific questions, like did you ever handle a gun, were you ever involved in anything that could have been seen as
I asked her specific questions. The most complicated ones are around beheadings and executions. She said, I've seen a head in a bin, I haven't seen any executions. And the head in the bin, she famously said, yeah, I'm unfazed by that. But whether she was fazed by that and said she was unfazed afterwards, or whether she was genuinely not moved by the head in the dustbin, I don't know. I wasn't shocked by anything she said. Not that it wasn't radicalised. It was radicalised, but that was, I didn't expect her to say, yeah, the whole thing was terrible, I don't know what we were doing. I was speaking to a deeply radicalised, slightly gobby, 19-year-old woman who was also a Londoner, who I could sort of relate to on enough of a level needed to have the conversation.
No, it sounds like that. It sounds like you know there was clearly a connection. It's interesting that her message and the way she handled interviews seems to have evolved a little bit, because there were later interviews. There was one with the BBC where she talked about forgiveness. I think she talked about how she wanted her nation, Britain, to forgive her. She didn't use that kind of thought or language at all with you.
No, she didn't. She was very... it was quite a pure interview. I was the first Westerner from the outside world that she would have seen since 2015. It was quite... She hadn't really thought too much about what she was going to say one way or the other, but it wasn't all. You could interpret some wiggle room there. She was saying she was, for a start, her husband, it appeared, had been in Islamic State prison for 6.5 months and was badly tortured. The fact she decided to leave Baghouz relatively early as a pregnant woman. Now, for everybody in this room, it's like, well, that's obviously a logical decision, or several months too late. But for many absolute devout state devotees, they'd be like, it's in the hand of God. I must endure and persist and stay. It wouldn't necessarily be that you're pregnant and leave.
Did she talk to you at all about her ambition to get back to London?
Oh, yeah. She said, I'm desperate to go home. I'm desperate to go home. She didn't try and varnish it by saying, yeah, I've sort of totally lost the whole ideology. She was just like, I'm desperate. I've lost 2 children. I don't want to lose my 3rd.
Yeah. So, final one for you, then we're going to open it up. But did you know, or did you have any sense of the sort of response? First of all, the massiveness of the story as it was going to hit the streets in London, and second, the kind of response it was going to generate, which, you know, it has to be said, included a huge amount of sort of
rage and
fury and just hate, frankly, directed at
no,
her.
not on either count. It was quite strange. So I left thinking that's a strong story. This is an emblematic case which is already firmly seeded in Britain's psychology. I mean, this case was very high profile in 2015. And oddly, it was made particularly high profile by the police, by the authorities, because they encouraged the families to go public in a very big way in 2015 in the hope that they could get the girls back from Turkey, which didn't work out. So everybody knew about this case. It was very specific because of the ages of the girls. They were minors. So I knew it was an important story to follow through, which is why I was looking for her. But my perspective was, even realizing how radicalized she was, I thought, look, I found one of the 15-year-old schoolgirls 4 years down the line. Of course, this is an emotive subject, but overall, I'm pretty sure most people in my country will want her back because she was a 15-year-old minor when she left. So that was point number. That was what I anticipated. I didn't anticipate in any way the scale of the story, but also I left her filed. The next morning I drove across the desert, crossed the river, drove a lot more. I was out of contact with the world for the next following day. I had a 5 o'clock plane to get, so I got a plane. I hadn't connected with the world. I got back here, I got on a train, I didn't go into the office. I went home, and it was only when I got home and logged in, I was like, God, what on earth is going on? It's like beast day at the Colosseum here, of rage, hate.
Yeah. All right. Let's bring our other two panelists in. Nesrine, tell me how closely you'd followed this story of the Bethnal Green girls.
Well, can you hear me? Sorry, this is weird sort of Britney Spears music video earphones where you don't feel like you're actually speaking into a microphone. I had followed it, but as a part of a thread that actually started, or I paid attention to it when people began to call for stripping the Rotherham sex abusers of their passports.
Oh, okay.
And so it's been the sort of the question of stripping Muslims in particular of their citizenship has been in the water for quite a few years. And so when this came up, I sort of instinctively felt this was going to be the next part of the story, which is, you know, she's a traitor, she's not British, she hasn't integrated, and therefore she needs to give up her citizenship. And what's interesting about that angle of the story is that it's very, it's exaggerated when it comes to Muslims, and you don't really hear about it when it comes to other minorities. And the interesting thing about it is that I'm originally from Sudan, and we have had a lot of ISIS wives and students, particularly from one medical school in Khartoum, leave to join ISIS. And it is as much a shock and a betrayal and a sort of a leaving of the senses as far as their Sudanese Muslim Arab families were concerned, as it is to British people. But the sort of citizenship element of it never came into the question, because it wasn't seen as a choice between one citizenship and another. It was just seen as kids basically taking leave of their senses and becoming radicalized. And so the Shamima Begum case has been, I think, good, because all the things that we were warning about sort of dangerous messaging when it comes to how we talk about minors, how we talk about radicalized people, how we refer to ISIS fighters, how we talk about Muslims in general that seem to transgress, how we essentialize them. The Shamima Begum case was a very good case because it shows that when we don't check ourselves when we talk about these things, you end up in a situation where you said it's like a beast in the Colosseum, where the person is just savaged, even though they were 15 when it all happened. So that's the particular angle that I was interested in.
No, that's very interesting. So, Shiraz, let me ask you whether you, from a security point of view, when you read the story, found that Anthony had found the girl, young woman, whether you were surprised about how officialdom handled it, how the story then unfolded so very quickly.
I mean, we've been working on the conflict in Syria now since 2013, when that flow of foreign fighters began to become noticeable. And I think there's a few things to sort of disaggregate it. I don't think officialdom has handled this well, but I don't think they've handled Syria well at any stage of this conflict. But the important point here right now with relation to this issue is that this is the single most pressing issue of what happens to those who are detained in SDF custody. This is essentially the next phase, the next iteration of this war. This is a war that has not been static at any stage. So in 2011, you have this phase of an armed insurrection that is Syrian, that is the Free Syrian Army emerging as an actor to defend the civilian population that is essentially largely still a protest movement. And then there have been subsequent iterations thereafter. This phase of rampant non-state actor activity, particularly of a jihadist element that has controlled large sections of territory in Syria and Iraq, is clearly now coming to an end. The Syrian state, is consolidating control once again. So this is clearly the next big security dilemma. And there are several interconnected and interrelated questions. There are no easy answers to my mind. One of the things I've been asked repeatedly is, what's your opinion? What do you think should happen? I don't really have a strong view. I've looked at this issue so many times, and I invite you to do the same, to look at all the interconnected issues. So the most obvious answer is, these are British people. I agree with Nesrine completely that the stripping of citizenship is a disgraceful tactic and something we can talk about later. But if you take your principled position at the start, which is to say, these are British citizens, they travelled out there, they've committed crimes out there, they're our problem, they grew up here, we should bring them back, we should prosecute them and send them to jail for a very long time. So we can start on that premise. Move down from that, and you say, okay, we have a robust legal system in this country. There are real concerns about the ability to secure convictions against some of those, not all, and it really depends on the nature and the actions that the individual committed out there and their public profile. But women in particular who didn't have the same kind of public profile have a slightly more complex issues related to them. Clearly, no one wants to see people who travelled out to ISIS territory, who engaged in atrocities, or who have been part of this enterprise at whatever level, coming back and simply being allowed to walk out of Heathrow and to roam the streets as free individuals. So that's one part of the problem.
Well, let me interrupt you at that point.
Yeah.
Just to ask you, do you believe, and Nesrine as well, all of you, do you believe that a young woman, indeed a child as she was when she went out there, who went, it seems, to in the hope of being a jihadist bride, of joining the movement, but she wasn't a trained fighter and it's not clear she ever intended to fight, should she be regarded as a security threat, as a terrorist? Is she a terrorist in any meaningful way?
I tell you what, this would be a really good moment to play that clip. It's only a couple of minutes long. This clip is from the Home Office Select Committee in, I think, March 2015. So this was within weeks of the girls going. Speaking are Bernard Hogan-Howe, who's head of the Met at the time, and his deputy, Mark Rowley. It only lasts a minute, but you will see how these two senior policemen speak to the three missing girls then and what their culpability is, and compare that to now.
People travelling to Syria and Iraq. But in this particular case, the girls concerned, they've made a huge and terrible mistake, but they are very young girls compared with the other people. And in this particular case, without going into the other case, but in this particular case, do you have any reflections on how we could get them back safely to this country?
I think there's an
from where
important
we are now?
There's an important thing to say here. It's every case on its merits. We have no evidence in this case that these three girls are responsible for any terrorist offences. I think that's important. So they have no reason to fear that if there's nothing else comes to light, no reason to fear that we'll be treating them as terrorists if they come back to this country.
In other words, if they return, they will not be returning to jail. They can return to their families.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying
Yes.
today?
Yes.
And that's your clear statement to them?
Absolutely.
I'm not suggesting they're watching the proceedings of the Home Affairs Select Committee. But if the message goes out that if they return, there are no terrorism issues here.
Yeah.
But I think it's a vitally important point because, you know, we've been challenged in the past that when people have gone, we believe in terrorism, sometimes they've changed their mind.
Sure.
Do you encourage them to come back or do you condemn them to stay there? But in this case, it's very clear.
There's a difference between the person who has been running around northern Iraq and Syria with the Kalashnikov and then has a touch of the seconds and wants to come back and apologise. That's very different to three young girls who we have no evidence to suggest they're involved in terrorism.
Thanks.
Very, very interesting. Obviously, 4 years makes a big difference, certainly in terms of official reaction and response. I suppose one could argue he was speaking very soon after they'd gone, when they were still minors. They were still 15 years old. 4 years on, they're adults, and their culpability, I suppose, can be, if you want to see it that way, can be said to have changed. And
Britain's suffered some horrific terrorist attacks in those intervening 4 years as well.
Yeah.
Which have moulded public opinion, not only in a way that's angered public opinion.
So let's cut to the chase and the nature of the debate in the UK since your story broke, Anthony, which is that according to both anecdotal evidence and I think some polling as well, a very clear majority of the British public would have no truck with the idea that this young woman had rights as a British citizen, and they supported the government's announcement that they were going to strip her of her citizenship. That seems to be where the British public was, in a clear majority. I'm guessing from what you've already said, none of you three felt that was justifiable.
No, I didn't think it was justifiable, but I think it's important that it's okay to have that conversation. I think it's important for it to be not taboo to have a conversation about whether there should be any hurdle at all to citizenship. I mean, it's not, I think, an idea that is, well, I don't agree with it, but I think it's fine that there is a conversation around what citizenship entails, when it is a privilege, when it should be taken away. Again, I reiterate, I feel very strongly against this because I'm a dual citizen, and so I'm definitely against citizen stripping. But I think that there is something emotive about citizenship that I think bears some space around it to talk about how when people feel like they have been betrayed, when somebody has gone to a new state that has very clear enemy combatant ideas about British people, about Christians, I think it's not unreasonable to have the conversation. Having said that, I think one very important thing that happened over the past 4 or 5 years and over the past decade in general is Theresa May and Sajid Javid. And I sincerely believe that if it were not Sajid Javid, who was Home Office Minister at the time, I don't think she would have been stripped of her citizenship. And I think that apart from the 4 years of terrorism and attacks that happened and kind of general radicalization of British people against Muslims that happened recently, there has also been a radicalization by the Conservative government and the Home Office and the general tenor when it comes to Muslims and radicalization and terrorism. And I think that Javid is continuing Theresa May's policies, and I think that he's a performative Home Office minister, and that if it was somebody more relaxed about being brown, if it was Amber Rudd, she would not have stripped her. And so I think that this is where we need to be really careful around picking a single thread or a single narrative around the reaction to Shamima Begum. To me, the overarching theme is just the hostility that has been sown over the past few years towards Muslims, towards the sort of the pathologizing of Islamic related criminal behavior. Like, for example, if we don't treat Shamima Begum as someone who went and joined a criminal gang, for example. You know, we can say she got on, she fell in love with a guy wearing leather jackets and had tattoos and got on a bike with him and he was a cocaine dealer, for example. The conversation is around, betrayal and being a traitor and not being integrated, not being British in the first place. The Metro had a headline calling her baby a jihadi baby 2 days ago. So I think that there are the legal issues, there's the civil discourse, there's the security discourse, but the climate over the past 10 years, I think, has been leading us here. And Sajid Javid's ascension to the Home Office has basically put the British state on a collision course with Muslims.
Could I just dive in very quickly on that point? The Shamima Begum case in and of itself is largely irrelevant. And you've actually been very soft on Sajid Javid's predecessors. Amber Rudd stripped over 100 people of their citizenship. And the process started with Theresa May when she was at the Home Office. The point of principle is what matters. That's what I'm really concerned about here. Shamima Begum, in that context, is an irrelevance. I'm not, as much as we want to talk about her, that concerned in this instance with her. It's this principle that the children of immigrants, that our citizenship is somehow predicated on continued good behavior. That my daughter doesn't have a citizenship that exists into perpetuity because she has the possibility to acquire another citizenship. It's not even based on being a dual citizen at the same time. And all we're doing, just to finish that point, is offloading our problem onto Syria and Iraq as if the people of those countries haven't suffered enough.
Yeah, okay, there's several things I want to try to...
Sorry, can I just interject?
Yes.
In anticipation
Yes,
of what
you
I think you might
can.
say. First of all, sadly, I agree with you both. And for anyone doubting the race or ethnicity or religious element to this, should go and check a recent story by the Daily Mail on two Austrian ISIS girls who decided to join, and they're both white Austrians. And the comments, even from Daily Mail readers beneath their story, is, oh, what a shame, what a loss, what a tragedy. And yet you read the comments below, certainly in regards to my paper, The Times, to Shamima Begum, and 2/3 of them are like, rot in hell, never come back. You know, there's a clear race issue here, and religious issue. But what I would say is, let's not forget the 30 Brits slaughtered on the beach in Tunisia, the 22 Brits blown apart in the Manchester Arena, the repeated attacks on Westminster. And let's not forget as well quite how extremely dangerous Islamic State are. And do you want to be yourself in the decision-making process of who you come back, who you bring back, who you can ensure through a de-radicalization process, which is already in question, because it's very hard to judge who's de-radicalized and who's not, who then doesn't kill again on our streets. Now, that's a very real fear.
It sure is.
It's a very real fear.
So, I don't know if you, when you went on Newsnight, actually used the term Islamophobia or racism about the Sajid Javid decision. Was it both?
I said it was racist.
You said it was racist.
But
do you think it was, I mean, do you, and Nesrine as well, do you use the word Islamophobic about Sajid Javid's decision?
No, he's not that bright. He's just he's just an opportunist. Sajid Javid is an opportunist. To be Islamophobic in the Tory party or in Tory governments, you have to have a very kind of deliberate view of the world, and Sajid Javid does not have that. I think he just wants to show that he can be as harsh on other brown people as his white colleagues.
But to devil's advocate for a little bit, it is quite sensible in the UK, particularly given Anthony's reminders of all the atrocities we've witnessed, it's quite sensible to be IS-phobic and terrorism-phobic.
No, I agree.
And you know what? Maybe you are seeing this case, the Begum case, in a way that fits with as you said, a long-running narrative that you've seen in the UK. But in this particular case, we are talking about somebody who went to join an organisation committed to the destruction of our society.
I agree, and that's why I said I think it's okay to have that conversation. I don't think the conversation around what being a British citizenship entails is one that is taboo or beyond the pale.
You did say that, but you also, Nesrine, you did say, let's imagine that she'd gone off to join a crime gang.
Yeah.
But the point is, she didn't go off to join a crime gang. She went off to join this one organisation which is absolutely committed to blowing us up and destroying our society and civilization. And that matters.
No, it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much, I think, as the environment of propaganda around it. If she were, it's all about degrees and shades. If she were an active combatant, if she went there to fight, this would be a done deal, I think. But if she
your position surely wouldn't be, because your position is a point of principle on the citizenship issue.
Yeah, I mean done deal in the sense that we would be having a valid conversation about whether she should be whether she should be let back, whether she's a threat, etc.
Right.
I think the specificity of Shamima Begum's case, and this is where I think she actually does matter, is that she was a minor when she left. She's only 19 now. From the interview, it was very clear that she was just a sort of gobby Londoner who wanted to actually prove that she wasn't fazed by any of it. And so, to answer your question, of course, it's not the same in terms of the public reception of it to go off and join a gang vis-a-vis going off and joining ISIS. But that difference has been completely exaggerated to turn her from a minor who went to marry someone to someone who would, has committed crimes or is a serious threat to the UK. Therefore, it is absolutely legitimate to have that conversation, but there is so much space that is being exploited to wedge in irrelevant issues, I think, vis-a-vis her, Muslims, radicalization in general, that is making it very hard to measure that appropriate distance between her being an active criminal and her being a minor who made a mistake and wants to come back home.
Okay, I think we're into territory now where I'd love to bring the audience in. Shiraz, I think you want to say something, and then we're going to open it up. Yeah. We've got roving microphones, so get ready to ask us questions.
There's just 2 points. I mean, the language has come up again a couple of times about them being jihadi brides. This really robs them of their agency, I think. This is not always the case that women who travel to Islamic State territory went there to become brides.
What would you describe them as?
A lot of them are ideological actors in the way that the men were. They may go well to perform other roles,
right,
rather than serve on the front lines, which was not
so
an
they're
option
part
for
of the
them.
terrorist enterprise.
They're part of a terrorist entity. Shamima Begum herself said, I did nothing wrong apart from join ISIS. Well, you joined ISIS. And so that is an important part of this. And I'll just finish with, when Anthony just spoke, I mean, this gets to the heart of the issue, really, which is, the question is really, how do you get justice against the members of ISIS? How do you get some form of justice, and who dispenses that? And what is the best mechanism for doing that? No one is saying that these people are saints or, belittling their many, many, many crimes. I mean, the systematic extermination campaign against the Yazidis on a scale that hasn't been seen in the world since the Nazis, frankly. I mean, this is an incredible sense of crimes against humanity. So it does have to be something the international community thinks about. How do you bring members of ISIS to justice? The only really, truly innocent actors in all of this are the children who were taken there or who have been born out there.
Just one point of detail before we get to questions. There is a white British IS jihadist, is there not, in one of these ways, in a prison somewhere in northern Syria, isn't he?
I can't talk about that.
Well, okay.
Due to legal reasons.
You can't talk about it for legal reasons.
I can.
But you can, good. So he has not, as I understand it, been formally stripped of his British citizenship, but he is not being allowed to there's no way the British government's going to have him back. Is that right at the moment?
He's actually dual nationality. He's British-Canadian.
Yeah.
At the moment, he seems sort of frozen in limbo. He hasn't, to my knowledge, been stripped of his citizenship, but his applications to go to Canada, I mean, he's held in jail.
Yeah.
Unlike Alexander Kote or El Shafi al-Sheikh, the two surviving members of the so-called Beatles, who have been stripped of their citizenship and are also held in jail.
And any of you have any different feeling about the stripping of citizenship from two guys who it seems there is very strong evidence to connect to, beheadings, violent
None of it's
acts?
a solution. At the moment, you've got 900 foreign fighters from 49 nationalities, over 2,500, nearly 3,000 foreign fighter family members, muhajirin, kettled together in a series of camps of varying security, with nowhere to go, mixed with about 50,000 plus Syrian and Iraqi Islamic State fighters. Nobody knows what's happening to them. Iraq said they'll have 20,000 back. But what happens to the rest? The last time we had this example, Camp Buka, where the Americans just kettled a whole lot of Islamic fighters of different factions together, you found that Islamic State in Iraq prevailed, and they all had plenty of time to work out their command structures and how they were going to do the next stage. So to kettle this amount of people, this amount of radicals, in probably one of the least secure places in the Middle East, where the next chapters of war are very unknown, but the only agreement is that the war is not finished, just is not going to work. It's not going to provide our security. It's not going to provide regional security. It's a disaster waiting to happen. It's just, it doesn't work. There's no solution.
All right.
Oh, there's no solution on the table. There should be.
No. Well, I'm not going to get your version of a solution right now because I do want to get some questions, but I'm sure we'll get to that. Okay, so let's open it up. What I want are succinct questions, ideally. So there's your challenge. Let's start at the back. And actually, are you chief microphone operator, Austin? All right. Well, let's start at the front then, because you happen to be at the front. This gentleman.
I have no idea what succinct means.
Well, it just means short and to the point.
Oh, okay. So you got... Yeah, I'm not short and to the point. So when you got very passionate just then about your the bombings and the terrorist thing, how difficult was it for you when you were sat opposite her in Syria how difficult was it for you not to just break into that, which you've just done now, and got really passionate about it? How difficult is that for you to keep?
That's a good question. I find it usually quite easy because I've been doing it for quite a long time, and that you've got to disassociate yourself before you go in. Far more difficult. Her, she was quite easy to engage with, and it was like dealing with a slightly gobby Aussie teenager. Far more difficult were Al-Shafi al-Sheikh and Alexander Cote, the two surviving members of the so-called Beatles cell, who had tortured and killed friends of mine. And I went in to that interview thinking, I guess I'm going to have to shake their hand, right, if they stand up, because it's a point of respect. If you meet somebody as a journalist in whatever environment, prisoner, terrorist, militia commander, freedom fighter, politician, general, whoever they are, you shake their hand in salutation of the space and the agreement to talk. And before I saw those two, I was like, I don't know if I can bear to shake their hands. How am I going to handle this? In fact, they were both handcuffed when I walked in. The handcuffs were removed for the interview, but there was enough space between us that it would have looked really awkward if I'd walked over and shaken their hands. So it was kind of like, I guess I'm out of that. It's just that social situation. That was much more difficult because those guys, unlike Shamima Begum, were absolutely unreconstructed, very hard, very aggressive. I was not going to catch them out with any question that they hadn't thought through before. They were totally committed. It was far softer, far easier. She wanted to speak to me. It was easier for me to disassociate. So it can be difficult to disassociate, but you have to. I've had friends who say, well, yeah, when you see them, why don't you spit on them and stuff? It's like, come on. It's like, I've got to respect their status as captive. I've got to respect their status as somebody who wants to speak to me. I always give them that, remind them of that. You don't have to speak to me. And in her case, I mean, it was okay, perfectly okay. Our conversation between us was, there were difficult moments when she talks about beheading of journalists, and I reminded her that I was a journalist, and all the rest of it. It was manageable. It was manageable.
Ma'am, you've got the mic, I think. Yeah, go on.
Thank you very much. I've got 3 points to make. The first one is...
succinct, remember that word? Yeah.
Very quickly. We've had Taliban, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS. And the last 2 were came about same time as we've had the foreign liberating foreigners and armies in these countries. Food for thought. What is going on? Most of the foreign army in Syria is to fight against the Syrian government. ISIS does the same thing. Second point is I agree with Nesrine about our Home Secretary. If he was white, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There is a legal point here. She was born British, she is British by birth and descent. Was he legally able to strip her? And I think there may be a legal point to discuss whether he was allowed to actually take her citizenship away. The third point I'd like to make very quickly is, my understanding is the local community at the time were aware of the fact that she was being radicalized. Why didn't anybody do something about it?
Okay, well, they're all really interesting points. Shiraz, do you want to address the first point about the commonalities in the rise of these jihadist organizations?
Well, they've all arisen in response to political events in their countries, whether it's the fight against the Soviet Union in the 1980s in Afghanistan, or subsequent to the invasion of Iraq, 2003. These are, of course, reactions and hugely episodic events in those countries that have resulted in these groups. I don't know what more to say than that. I mean, it's food for thought. It's plainly, when you have chaos and disorder in these countries, or in any country, this is what happens. You could see that very, very clearly in Syria as the law and order situation broke down, as the government lost increasing amounts of control, not least for its own actions of brutalizing its own people, and it should be said, it's a disaster and a crisis of its own making. That was absolutely the environment in which this kind of thing would grow. It wasn't an immediate thing that arose. It slowly slipped into this. For those of us who worked on this, you could see it from 2011 through to the end of 2012. This was not the dominant nature of what the Syrian conflict was, but as the situation continued to deteriorate, as people became more desperate, as Syrian actors directly began to lose control over their own destiny, the influx of foreigners, the sort of rise of jihadist movements was pretty much an inevitability, and of course it came to be the dominant facet of the argument.
I guess the net result of the last 10 years is that authoritarians, tyrants, can still say to the world, you talk of democracy, you talk of getting rid of me, and you just look at what you unleash. You look at the degree to which extremism, fanaticism can follow in the wake of the breakdown of my centralized authority.
I think that's unfair in the Syrian context. Look at the radical elements that took root in the Syrian uprising. Well, it didn't start that way. It was a legitimately Syrian, unjust opposition to a brutal and tyrannical regime that persisted. And it was a Syrian-led thing. The Free Syrian Army defectors were people who were defecting out of conscience as to what was happening. The radicals who were leading groups like Ahrar al-Sham and all these other groups, where were they in 2011? They were sitting in Assad's prisons. He released them.
No, I think that's a good answer, and I don't want
to
divert us too much, and I certainly don't want to sound like an apologist for Assad, which was the danger of my question.
The crisis is his making.
No, good. Let's leave that there. I'm agreeing with you. But quick, Nesrine, on the latest points about Shamima Begum's background and the depriving her of her citizenship, the taking away of her citizenship, the degree to which there's any legal basis on that for justification for that, and how come her community, the question suggests, knew these girls were being radicalized and did sod all about it?
Well, on the legality of it, the allegation, the idea, is that if you have recourse to a second citizenship, therefore it is not illegal. So even if you don't have a second citizenship, but you have the right to receive a second citizenship, then you are not made stateless. What is illegal is to make someone stateless. But, I mean, for all intents and purposes, if that person has no recourse to getting that second citizenship, you are making them stateless, and you are basically playing with technicalities. And that is what has happened with Shamima Begum. And I think it's really quite a violation, actually. And I think that, I just wanted to make this point earlier, there's two dimensions to the story. There's the sort of international security breakdown element of it and how this doesn't help things. But there's also the national story, the domestic story. So how does that play out domestically? It plays out in two ways. One is it sends a very clear populist message, and it throws something to the baying dogs, which is, we've stripped her of her citizenship, and it makes people feel better. And at the same time, however, it sends a very strong message to all those people who had certainty in their citizenship, whether they're born here, children of people who were born here, that might have some notional ability to get a second citizenship somewhere else. Even if you're not radicalized or have no intention of being radicalized, it makes you feel like you're lesser than. And this is a very, very important point. And Javid and this Home Office does not care about that, because they're playing only to an audience, and they've raised the bar of citizenship so much, which is, you come here, you behave a certain way, and if you don't, then we kick you out, or we strip you, because you will never have a 100% right to be a British citizenship because you're not indigenous, whatever the hell that means. And so that's my answer to the legality of it. This is kind of it's a fig leaf that he's taken shelter behind. On the question of why people didn't report her, I mean, we don't know, right? Like, we don't know how far people think it had gone. We don't know, and this is actually a really difficult question, and we went through this in Sudan as well, where a different dynamic happened, where lots of middle-class, quite affluent kids went and joined ISIS, as opposed to kind of ghettoized immigrant children here or in the other parts of Europe, and no one could figure it out. You know, they just say he just began to get a bit more quiet. He began to pray more. We didn't really think, and then he was going to do anything, and suddenly he disappeared. So you can't really tell. And also there's the fear that, and there was an interview with someone from her community on the radio, and they said that, you know, we genuinely didn't feel like we could go to the police or we could go to security forces and not be ourselves cast under suspicion or fall under suspicion. So there's a whole mishmash of distrust, of, you know, communities feel like they're not particularly integrated, but who knows?
Let me
it's not a satisfying answer.
No. Let's take two at once. So again, keep them brief as you can. You two guys near each other.
Hello. To the whole panel, one of the things I'm interested in is there's this characterization of Shamima Begum as kind of grumpy and sullen, perhaps, and you can see that in the interview. But I wonder if you could reflect upon the possibility that she's so psychologically detached because of the trauma she'd undergone. And then specifically to Anthony, I thought when I listened to the recording that the Times published and read your article after your reflection on it, I thought you dealt with it with a great deal of sensitivity. But I'm interested by your kind of ethical decision-making process behind interviewing someone who was about to give birth and had undergone a great deal of trauma not too long ago. And then moreover, I'm interested in you reflecting upon like your contemporary from Sky News who actually interviewed her just after she gave birth, and whether that's actually a you know, kind of a sensible ethical decision to make.
All right, thank you for that. And just the gentleman right behind you, yeah.
Yeah, hi. My question relates, a lot of what we've heard you speak about so far is about the context of her rights and her citizenship. I'd like to open up and talk more about the notion of, firstly, her words, her desire to come back. To what extent can we take that sincerity as being legitimate? And then secondly, her desire to come back. You know, you can look someone eye to eye, but how do we really judge the validity of someone's sincerity when they say, I believe I've done wrong, I want to do this, I want to come back? And then actually, in terms of rehabilitation, if you open it up to one person, then the idea of UK security, but also national security, if she's really willing to go through the process and be rehabilitated, where is it better for her to receive that care? Because we never fully know, once you've got someone back, you know, are they true to their word or can they be turned again? The ambiguity of this surely makes it so hard to know exactly where to put our faith and trust and our opinions on what's a good idea.
Yeah, all right. Well, so we're drilling down now into Shamima Begum's sort of psyche, the degree of her trauma, and then the ethics of...
She was grumpy and arsey, but she wanted to speak to me. It was not in any way an awkward conversation. And nor had she been got for me. The bloke had wandered off into the camp, and as I understand it, said, there's a British journalist who wants to speak to some British, as he would have said, jihadi wives, probably, muhajirin. And she was like, okay, take me to him. So, first of all, I had total consent. Secondarily, it wasn't all grumpy. It was quite articulate, it was quite easy, it was quite, dare I say it, relaxed. I mean, you listen to the interview, it was quite, you know, give and take. As for the issue of her pregnancy, there she was. I had consent. There was no guards there was no overlooking there. We moved, the sun at one point got high, we moved into a more shady place. TV is a very different beast. I don't want to cast judgment over how TV handled it later on, days later, when they managed to catch up with the story. I was...
There speaks a journalist with a scoop.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. I was so advanced. I was totally alone. She spoke my language, and it was much easier. It didn't have to be intrusive. I didn't have to nut her with some quite aggressive questioning over Manchester. We got to very complex issues over the beheading of journalists, including people I knew, in our own conversation without it having to be as aggressive as that. I didn't have to show her, you know, the decision revoking her citizenship on a phone so it could be on camera. It was an ideal situation. Two people, no one else. with total consent. And the first thing I said to her, as I've said now 3 times, first thing I said, look, you don't have to speak to me. You don't have to answer one question. You don't have to be here. Anything you do feel awkward about asking, just say it. I feel really awkward with that.
I mean, over many years, you will have spoken to a lot of people who are in the suffering from deep PTSD, or you know.
So
did she strike you as somebody in the midst of profound mental trouble, ill health?
Usually, it's very difficult to read extreme trauma as a common symptom, right? War is a traumatic event. Everybody you meet in war has been exposed to trauma. The difference is in individuals, how they process it, how quickly. She was extremely composed and extremely calm. You can read that in different ways. It might have meant she'd processed her trauma extremely well or not at all. Her faith and her religious belief would have also affected the way she saw the deaths of her 2 earlier infants and her degree of fatalism now. It was difficult to read. I would have said, you can't argue it too much, she would have been extremely traumatized. How she had processed it and how she was with that was very difficult for me to gauge in an hour and a half.
Shiraz, take on the second question about how we know, or what do we think is the best way of dealing with people, you know, who have a claim to citizenship in a country that they've sort of declared war on. What, in your view, having studied this in some detail, is the most effective way of dealing with these people?
Well, I mean, the short answer is we don't know, and there is no effective way to know, which again comes into that assessment that the government, that politicians, that the intelligence agencies are making when they are looking at these individuals and that issue of do you bring them back? Because the reality of it is, from about 2013 to some point in 2016, ISIS was the winning team, right? And everyone wants to play for the winning team. So these guys got out there and thought they were acting with complete legal immunity. They were boasting openly about their actions. You know, we archived millions of pieces of data out of this conflict, which was self-published voluntarily by these actors on the ground. I'll use the example of a Canadian fighter called Ahmed Wasim, who's been interviewed a lot by the Canadian press. You can see his interviews online. When you see him today, he is a completely, at least to the camera, dejected, defeated, disillusioned individual who says, you know, I messed up.
So where is he today?
He's in SDF custody. So he's facing the same situation just from Canada's perspective.
Yeah.
But what's significant about this guy is when James Foley was being beheaded, these guys were openly cheering those events. They were taunting the United States to put boots on the ground so that they could behead American soldiers. This change in narrative is, of course, partly related to the fact that they have been beaten back quite dramatically through kinetic action and are now sitting in prison, realizing that if they don't get taken home, what is the other alternative? They may well find themselves in Syrian state custody. And we all know what takes place there. So you would damn well expect them to be expressing lots of remorse and stuff. So the reality is we don't know. And this is another layering to the fact that this is a hugely, hugely complex problem, which I think, as we've all agreed, there's no easy solution. There's no actual answer to it. It's trying to muddle your way through to find the best worst-case scenario.
In a democracy, does public opinion play any role in this at all? I mean, leave aside what you think about Theresa May or Sajid Javid or whatever. I think it is pretty much indisputably true that a clear majority of the British people do not want any of these folks back on British soil. Does that matter? You know, we do live in a representative democracy. Should that be a factor?
We also have process of law, and that's what it's going to boil down to when the sound and fury subsides. I don't know about the polling, but is there a silent majority who actually want them back? I kind of doubt it. I think Shamima Begum's case is very specific because of her age, and that will, when all the opinion and the emotion subsides, it's going to be down to the process of law. And that is part of our democracy, which is instilled out just to take over from lynch mob mentality. And I hope that process of law will recognise that her case, her age, her citizenship are all very valid to take into account. and will one day, for my opinion, bring her back to face investigation, to be judged accordingly to her actions, and then de-radicalised. That's my opinion. But it'll be process of law which ends up dealing with this in her case.
Right, we'll get two from this row, if we may. So you start then.
Hi, yes.
There's the lady in the corner here, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So in a couple of years, if you were to be in another refugee camp and to face this same fact pattern where you found another, jihadi bride of British mixed race ancestry, and knowing the way that the British public have reacted to this story, would you still interview that woman and produce a story?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes, I would. And here's how I see it. This is a key example of the place that journalism has and its role as part of our democracy. Information feeds debate, social debate, debate in our judicial systems and our political systems. And that drives policy. Now, at the moment, we haven't got to the point at which there is a finality in policy here. There will be an appeal. Sajid Javid is under pressure. It's all still in play. It was not down to me in that refugee camp to suddenly go, I found someone who is an emblematic case already firmly established in the British mind since 2015, and not interview her or start erasing stuff she said or playing up stuff one way or another. Personally, I don't like the brutish rage I've seen expressed in this society towards her specifically. I quite understand the role of emotion and the feelings towards Islamic State. I don't like Sajid Javid's decision, primarily over and above everything else. It was hasty. He did it really quickly. It's very complex case. She's many things, Shamima Begum. She's an adult, combat-age female of a terrorist group whose aim is to absolutely destroy us. She's also the 15-year-old, a minor, who was groomed here and went there. It's a very complex case. What's happened in the last few weeks since I saw her, there's this baying mob mentality. She's had her citizenship revoked. A photograph I took of her ends up getting used as target practice in a Merseyside gun club to be pumped full of lead. And then her son, who she has just after I see her, dies of a chest infection in deplorable conditions in a refugee camp. I'm hardly sitting here thinking, God, this is a great example of what a positive role journalism can play in our democracy. But nevertheless, the ideal of journalism, absolutely I adhere to, and absolutely I would do it again.
I did promise, you go ahead.
Two very quick questions. The first, our Foreign Secretary says that it's way too dangerous to offer consular services in a war zone, but you've already been there. So how dangerous was it for you to go? And how dangerous do you think it would be for our consular services to be able to get there? And then the second question, the next big debate we're going to see is about the kids. And do you see that we'll begin to see the discussion around separating kids from parents? Because kids who have British rights under the right of a child versus, we don't want the mothers coming back.
So there are parts of Syria which are very dangerous and parts which are not. The al-Hawl camp is almost totally benign. I mean, it's 150 miles north of the front line. The key bit of that information really is how many hours drive is it from the nearest British consulate, which if you wanted to get someone home, you'd have to get them to a consulate. The nearest consulate's in Erbil in northern Iraq, so that would probably be from al-Hawl camp, 3 hours to the border, half an hour crossing, 3 hours drive through secure areas. It's not dangerous.
So that element of the argument was ridiculous.
In the chat, it's a ridiculous element of the argument. I will leave the issue of children.
Well, Nesrine, have you thought about that? That whether there could be a case or any justification for, getting the kids out and leaving the adult who decided, albeit as a minor, decided to go and join the jihadists and the terrorists in northern Syria in the blighted camp they're in, and just bring the kid home to safety.
Well, that comes back again to the point of due process. It comes back to the point of the rule of law. If there was a system that was not hastily cobbled together for populist purposes, then it would make perfect sense that if there was a British child of someone that you think that needs to be tried or interrogated or questioned, that they are brought back to the UK and due process followed. You know, whatever that due process is for a criminal investigation. And I think, actually, I mean, it's obviously a terrible thing that Shamima Begum's baby died, but the fact that he did brought the story back again and the spotlight again onto the decision. Because, I mean, the technicalities meant, I mean, I don't think that they could have got the baby back in time and all of those things, but I think it focused people's minds that if you cannot see Shamima Begum as someone who was groomed and a minor at the time, there was a baby who you could not strip of citizenship, who died in circumstances in a legal limbo because his mother was stripped of citizenship. And so to avoid all these sort of, you know, moral quandaries, one should just simply follow the rule of law. One should simply treat these people as either find a taxonomy for them. So even if the Home Office is confused, even if it's very difficult for them to kind of find a way to think of jihadi brides or people that went there who weren't a Shafi'a Sheikh, who weren't part of the Beatles, it should be thought through. You know, there should be a taxonomy of terrorists, ISIS fighters, combatants versus brides versus people that went there but you can't really put anything on them. And there doesn't seem to be very much of a thought through attitude about it, which I understand is difficult because the situation is messy and has been changing quite a lot recently. But to throw, no pun intended, to throw the baby out the bathwater and just be like, okay, now we're going to strip the citizenship from the parents and therefore the babies are in this legal limbo and we can't bring them back separately, is a violation of the children's rights, and it can be very easily prevented if people just had the wherewithal and the moral fiber just to have the ability to follow due process and the law as opposed to make decisions willy-nilly for populist purposes.
Right. I can see lots of hands still up, and we have about, if we're optimistic, about 10 minutes left. So let's just take a few points in one go, if we can. Austin, you're poised. So let's get the gentleman at the back there, and then we'll go to the corner there, and then we'll quickly work our way down. But you're going to have to promise me, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be really quick with your points now to squeeze as many in as we can.
Sure. Hi, my name is Farhad Ahmed. I'm an imam from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And my question is around, as a Muslim, whenever we usually see stories, I think this story, particularly when it was broken, I think it was an important one, as we've just highlighted, that it's brought a lot of legal questions into the debate, and I think it was important that this story did come to the fore, so I'm not against that. But what I do want to ask about is, a lot of Muslims, they do feel quite frustrated when the only stories that do make it into the media are negative, and these are frustrations which are discussed on the dinner tables of Muslims. And what role and responsibility do you think the media has to try and counter some of these frustrations that do exist? Because at the end of the day, these are the frustrations which are preyed upon by extremists.
Okay, we'll deal with that, but we'll just get one more quick thought in. Go on.
Quick question directed quite particularly at Shiraz here, who may have particular insight. I just want to ask about your thoughts on de-radicalization. We've seen the program in the UK, which has been controversial. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they've all tried these programs and with seemingly mixed results. So I'm very interested in your view on how far it's possible to take the most deeply indoctrinated people, as we have here, and to turn them back into the kind of systems that we'd be happy to have with them.
So Nesrine, I'm going to ask you to respond to the gentleman's point about the media's responsibility to not simply focus endlessly on the sort of the negative, the terrorist-related, the violent, when it comes to covering stories concerning Muslims.
It's a very good question, and it's a difficult one because if a story is legit, it needs to be covered. We can't pretend these issues aren't happening. We can't pretend that ISIS has not been a terrible blight on the Arab world and many Muslims, and on Britain as well. And I would be very nervous if anyone, and I struggle with this myself, that when I write about Islamophobia or Muslim-related issues, to make sure that I'm not trying to kind of subconsciously steer clear of something that can be used against Muslims, because it's such a an epidemic these days. So I think that Anthony absolutely should have covered that story. If there are any other terrorism stories out there that can teach us and that can illustrate how these things happen, in the absence of responsible government policy, I think it's actually the responsibility of the media to do this, because the politicians are failing. Having said that, the media is also failing massively when it comes to over-egging or not fact-checking or being really eager to put stories out there about Muslims that are not true or that have been embellished. And the Times has not covered itself in glory in the past about this, particularly with the Muslim foster children case, where they were berated by both the courts and the Press Complaints Commission. And I felt that that was really an example of not deliberate framing of Muslims, but because people want to hear these stories about Muslims, they want to hear about how the state is too politically correct and it's giving Christian children to Muslim parents and burqas so they can stop them from eating pork and, you know, forcing the Quran down their throats. That it makes journalists sloppy because it's such a popular narrative. And so those are the two sides to the question. Absolutely, we should absolutely cover Islamic terror-related issues, not flinch and not shy away from them because of the environment. But at the same time, there is a lot of culpability for the media for creating that environment in the first place by either exaggerating or going out of their way to find pathologizing stories about Muslims.
All right, thank you, Nesrine. Shiraz, on the second point about de-radicalization.
Yeah. So look, as you will know, there are lots of de-radicalization programs all over the world, which operate to varying degrees of success. One of the interesting things, I think, about the way they operate is they all have very local characteristics and dynamics, which really play off the political sort of status of those countries and the relationship between citizens and the state in those countries. So the Saudi program, which I've visited a lot, I've been out and seen it 3 times in person, including just as recently as probably about 18 months ago. You know, it's a very Saudi program. It's based on the realities of Saudi society, and of course the fact that the Saudi state feels like it can intervene as a state into that debate much more strongly to discuss what is authentic Islam, if you want to use that kind of term, to debate its own citizens who have sort of engaged in this kind of activity. I think in the UK, it's much more amorphous than all of that, right? It's much more complicated. And the reality is, look, not everyone who went to Islamic State went for the same reason. So it's very hard to say who can be de-radicalized, who can't. It would require a discussion, essentially, with that person to understand. I mean, you know, we mentioned the Bethnal Green Guards. They did go, after the atrocities of ISIS were very well established on the ground. These were not individuals who were going, who were naive or ignorant as to what was happening. When you had these discussions, you mentioned she'd seen these things. So it's coming back to the gentleman's question over there, it's hard to know, are these people who are genuinely disillusioned, who are looking for a way out, who want to engage with these types of programs, or are they simply saying this because there is a pragmatic reality, which is, I need to get the hell out of here before I end up in Assad's custody?
But we do in the UK have what you could recognise as a full-fledged rehabilitation thought-through program, do we?
We have 2 things. I mean, you have the Channel program, which is part of Prevent, and Prevent is designed to be, you know, before criminality.
Yeah, but I'm thinking much further down the track when people have either committed acts or joined groups.
So the one that operates in our prisons is voluntary, right? So you can't be compelled to do it. I mean, everyone, I'm assuming in here, will know who Anjem Chowdhury is, of course. You know, famously, when he was in, he was not engaged with it. I will say, for anyone in here who might be in the civil service, the UK makes it incredibly difficult for academics like us to get data about the way this operates in the UK prison system. I can go to Saudi and study their system easier than I can get into my own country's prisons to understand the way it's operating here. And
Really?
some of my colleagues have done it in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, but HMG, in its wisdom, denies us access to understand some of this. So how can you possibly speak about or assess or critique a system that you yourself can't get access to?
Right, Shiraz, thank you. I'm going to have two more. Is this going to be lucky dip? I'm going to take you and you two, just because I caught your eye, and unfortunately we're out of time. So last two comments, and do make them speedy.
Hi there, my name is Mansoor. I'm a British Imam here in the UK. My question is in regards to the writing of the story itself. So I work a lot with identity, and I work with Islamophobia as well, and try to break down some stereotypes. This story, in some ways, was brilliant because it opened up a platform for us to talk about some of the big issues in society. But in other areas, so for example, my wife is a hijab-wearing Muslim, so she's been called Shamima
Begum, yeah.
Not a name I can forget easily. Shamima Begum on numerous occasions said McDonald's thrown at her car while she's been driving. For me, this story, although very, very important, highlights something which is very quite fearful for me. And my question is with regards to how do you feel, something that Nesrine said as well, where the British public has been radicalized against Muslims, which is a really powerful statement. How do you feel that the Shamima Begum story will fuel that, or would it help to counter that? How do you think that will come about?
All right. Yeah, answer that, Anthony, and then we'll just get one last one. But go on.
It's not all hate and loathing. I mean, loads of people have written to me. I get a lot of weird mail. Some saying I'm an enemy of my country, I'm a terrorist sympathiser, and then some people saying you've thrown her to hell by writing about her. There are a lot of people write, and expressing the same sort of understanding that I feel I have for her case, which is, you are many things. You are the adult member of a terrorist organisation. You are also that 15-year-old who left, and I don't know quite the reasons and roots of her radicalisation, and nor will we know those until she comes back and answers them. I think I encounter in my correspondence and in my meetings, I've had quite a few meetings with people here about it too, quite a lot of, not sympathy certainly, but empathy and understanding. And I don't think it's just, the baying mob are always loud, but there is a more sophisticated foundation to the debate going on at the moment, I feel. But it's a very, very complex story. She's a very complex case, that's
so. If you don't mind me asking, I mean, leaving aside, Anthony breaking this story and it becoming such a big story, but progressively over, let's say, years, maybe the last 5 years, has your wife, particularly as is she in full hijab? Yeah. So has she come to feel progressively more uncomfortable, more threatened in recent years?
I'm loud enough for that.
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
So there is a notion where she was born here. She's a Pakistani by origin, but she was born here by ethnicity rather. She was educated here in university here, so she's very much British. But because of the way she dresses, so for example, after the bombings in Manchester, she was confronted by, for lack of a better word, a white skinhead who confronted her in an alleyway and said, "You did it, didn't you?" So it is there, but I mean, you can't say that. I can't be representative of everyone else and say, no, it's on the rise and we can see it on the rise. Even though there is lots of data to show that after these cases, Islamophobia has been on the rise.
Sure.
Has been on the rise. But particularly what I'm worried about is I am trying, and many people, I'm not unique in this, everyone in the world is trying to, well, not everyone obviously, to break down stereotypes and to create cohesion in society. But problems like this, when they rise up, I mean, just 2 days ago, we had a huge peace symposium in the biggest mosque in Britain, where we had MPs, academics, everyone that came down. And the global leader of my community, His Holiness Mr. Masroor Ahmed, he talked about the critical need for peace. It was covered by some outlets, and it was ignored by others. But if the case was about a caliph, as it is, talking about hatred on the other side of the world's talking about it for months. That's my issue.
Very well put, thank you. Yeah. We are just going to have to make this the last one, I'm afraid, but do go ahead. Yeah, you're, yep.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I just because I think they both think they're asking the last
sorry, I might not being clear, but well, frankly, holding the microphone is you have the power, so go for it.
Yeah. Okay, so my question is about actually Samantha Lewthwaite, who's known as the White Widow, who is British, who was married to one of the 7/7 bombers, who has been very overtly linked to terrorist atrocities in Kenya and in other countries, and is affiliated with al-Shabaab. So I was just wondering, you know, comparing that case to the case of Shamima Begum, and, you know, the treatment of Shamima Begum, I would like to kind of gauge your thoughts on that from a comparative point of view. Because I think this quite clearly demonstrates that, you know, there's deep inconsistencies in the way that the law is being applied here, and I do personally feel that, you know, racism has lots to do with it. And as a child of an immigrant, you know, this case does unsettle me very deeply. Yeah, if I could get your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have dealt with the Lewthwaite case in any detail.
I mean, the Lewthwaite case demonstrates that two-tier system in practice, right? Because, as far as I understand, she doesn't have recourse, even potentially, to another citizenship. So she remains British despite her actions into perpetuity. Whereas everyone else, who could theoretically, even if it's just theoretically, acquire another citizenship, has this problem. So it does demonstrate the problem very, very clearly in that sense. I just wanted to come back just very quickly, if I could. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about journalism. You know, I'm not a journalist. We have two colleagues up here who are, and stuff. This is a national discussion, right, about, okay, what are responsibilities of the state in this context? What does it, you know, and we're saying Shamima Begum is a British problem. Right, she's a British citizen. She was grown up here, and also, but also, let's be frank. Like, ISIS is a Muslim problem. Right, this is something that has come out of Islam. Whatever you think of it as an incorrect version or whatever, it is representing itself and passing itself off as that. So, as someone who grew up in the Middle East, I spent 14 years there, who's a Muslim himself, I recognize and say this is something that also we need to be taking responsibility of. I know you're saying you've been on this piece. There's a lot of this going on. I appreciate that. But what I'm also saying is, let's not just, you know, say it's all the fault of the Times or the Guardians or others. There is a big crisis here that you know, all of us as a collective need to be looking at. I imagine most of us are, because we're here on a Tuesday night looking at this. But you know, that's the issue. There is lots to be done by everybody on this, and it's wrong to deny that this is a construction. Whatever you think of it, it's a construction of a particular view of how some Muslims choose to view their religion, and that's a problem for us.
Yeah, thank you, Shiraz. We are out of time. In fact, we've overrun slightly, but we've overrun because there's so many great questions and thoughts.
There were very good questions.
Yeah, coming from all of you. So I'm sorry if I know I've left a few questions hanging. I'm really sorry about that. I don't know if you're going to go and have a drink at the bar or whatever. You might get a chance to ask a question to whoever you actually wanted to put it to. But I do need to draw proceedings to a close. I'm going to do it, of course, by thanking Shiraz, Anthony and Nesrine very, very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night. Thank you very much. I know it's deeply off topic, but just as a crowdsourcing issue, what happened in the vote? By how many?
29.
Oh my God, she was blown out of the water. Oh my God. Well, it's back to the real world, everybody.